Welcome to Healing Begins Here, a podcast by the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. I'm Olivia Oropeza, the Prevention Education Manager for the VSC, and I'm so glad you're here today. At VSC, we provide free, confidential support to survivors of sexual violence, violent crime, and traumatic circumstances. Whether it's advocacy, therapy, or crisis intervention, our team is here to help because no one should have to navigate the healing process alone. If you or someone you know needs support, our 24/7 crisis helpline is always available at 407-500-HEAL. That's 407-500-4325. Today we're diving into a topic that touches the lives of so many, the intersection of substance abuse and trauma. The relationship between substance use and victimization is complex and deeply intertwined. Research shows that people who have experienced sexual violence are more likely to develop substance use disorders, often as a way to cope with their trauma. At the same time, those who struggle with substance abuse are often at a higher risk of being victimized. This cycle can be incredibly difficult to break, but healing and recovery and empowerment are all possible. In this episode, we're speaking with two incredible guests who have walked that journey themselves. They'll share their experiences, the challenges that they've overcome, and the communities that they've built to help support others on the road to recovery. Before we begin, a quick content warning. We will be discussing substance abuse, addiction, and trauma, including sexual violence. If these topics are difficult for you, please listen at your own pace and reach out for support if needed. To start, I'm excited to introduce our first guest, Sarah Shoulak, founder of Sober Betties, a social group that brings people together for alcohol-free experiences in a fun, retro-inspired atmosphere. Sarah's journey to sobriety has been one of resilience and transformation, and today they're using their story to help others find joy and community without alcohol. Sarah, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely, it's an honor to be here.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about your journey? How did you find your journey to sobriety and kind of what brought you to that path?
Yes, it's been just over 7 years that I've officially been sober from alcohol and hard drug substances. And I have been an Orlando resident for 10 years. I've been in Florida for a total of 12, was in the Midwest before that. In my career, I have worked in a number of different areas, from being a faculty member at colleges to a number of agencies. And what I saw in all those different worlds was really just community and how to build community and keep that community together. What I also realized was over that same amount of time, the issues that I had with substances. A pretty common story, in college, you kind of overindulged a little bit as I was going through my undergraduate and graduate degree programs. And the big common thread that I saw throughout it all was that alcohol was my gateway drug, and every time I was overindulging in alcohol, it would lead to other things. So there was a moment that I refer to as when I hit my rock bottom, when you stop digging, and I said, this is really important to me, and this is something that I wanted to change in my life. And even if at that point I didn't see the long-term vision of what that change would mean in my life, I just made that decision to say, I need the mental clarity to work on myself, and I needed to create that space to unpack some of the things I was carrying with me. And that date is 12/13/17, so coming up on 8 years, but one day at a time.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
So your story sounds similar to maybe many others out there who recognized a pattern of a problem and made the steps forward to make a difference in their lives. And I love what you said, to focus on your own journey and what you need for yourself. So for so many people, substance use and trauma and victimization become deeply intertwined into their story. How did that connection show up for you in your life, and what helped you to start untangle it?
Thank you. It's a great question because you do have to be pretty introspective to acknowledge these things that are happening in your life. And in kind of a joking way, I would notice patterns where, like, every November I would get an itch to leave a job or move or break up with a boyfriend or something. There were things happening, but I didn't really see the greater vision. And then I actually started writing a book, and I had this big chronology where I was writing out these big things that had happened in my life, which were essentially kind of traumatic experiences, whether they were near-death experiences or, experiences of sexual assault or harassment, and traumatic things that have just been around my periphery. And then when I unpacked that and I saw the pattern, it was so obvious. And looking back after the 7 years of sobriety, you can see with those clear eyes of, wow, when you start to untangle that, these big emotions are really hard. And when I wasn't equipped with the ability to unpack these things and work through them on my own, then I would result in this kind of inflammatory blow up, or I'd shave my head, or I'd do something which you don't want to admit are those reasons, but that is kind of how it comes out and what it looks like. So I think that I wouldn't have been able to see those patterns if I was still kind of in the thick of it.
Yeah. So that element of self-reflection and you putting your story onto words and on paper and writing that down really helped you draw those connections and unravel kind of what was causing that cycle for you. So it sounds like that was a big part of your journey to sobriety, and that you're writing a book that's been very beneficial for you. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that and what that might look like?
Yeah, the book has been a newer project, a newer endeavor to go into, and I was an avid reader as a kid, so in my heart I think I just knew that I always wanted to write a book. I had the opportunity a few years ago to participate in an anthology with my mother, and so we were each writing chapters, and there were multiple other powerful female authors who all wrote chapters kind of looking back and giving advice to a younger version of yourself, which was also a very reflective exercise, a little less trauma-based in its content, but still very cathartic in that regard. So when I took on this project to write my own book, I kind of was having that imposter syndrome or crisis of self to say, what is my achievement? What is this big thing that I've done or that I have the skill set to look back and give people a guide to and say, here's my secret to success, be like me, do these things. And as simple as it might seem as an answer, it's the fact that I'm still here, and the fact that when I looked through that chronology of all these things that weren't the worst things that could happen to everybody, but just the amount and the frequency of them happening in my life, the fact that I'm still here is one element of it. And I think when I reflect on what a takeaway of the book would be for the reader, it would be that sometimes we think of the other side of sobriety as something that you're kind of like gritting your teeth and bearing it, and it's nails on a chalkboard and you're like getting through life by the skin of your teeth. And I think that with the book and with Sober Betties, I think the vision is that you can really find joy on the other side of trauma, and that sometimes when you're, again, in the thick of all that trauma and when you're going through the worst of it, and whether it's depression or trauma or substance abuse, it's hard to imagine so much levity and so much brightness on the other side, but there is.
Wow. I loved what you said when, I'm here. And that's what really matters, especially after all of those things that you've overcome and experienced. And I know for some people that on their worst days, like that's such a big accomplishment, is to just still be here. So thank you so much for sharing that. And we really look forward to what comes out of your book and how it might help others.
Spring 2026.
Awesome. So I want to know, just as we close out here, what are some things that you could say to folks at home who maybe are on their journey to sobriety or maybe are considering starting that journey? What are some words of encouragement or advice you might offer to them?
I think one of the biggest words I want to go back to that we have been talking about as a theme throughout this whole episode is community, is finding the people that feel right to you, because it's going to be different for everybody. And it might be Sober Betties, you might hear about what we do and who we are, and that really vibes with you. And if it's not your style and you have other activities or hobbies that you like to do, or you have a different pace of your life, or a religious group that you gravitate towards, those communities are going to be there for you. But the important thing to do is find the people who make you feel normal about these choices, especially when they're healthy choices, especially when they're things that in your heart of hearts you believe to be good and right for you. Go where those people reinforce those choices and kind of celebrate you for that. And they don't always have to be in a patronizing way of, oh, I have your mocktails, and in a really over-the-top way, but people who just don't treat you differently for those choices. Because there's going to be plenty of spaces as you go on your healing journey, whether it is versus substance abuse or trauma, there are going to be people who don't really like that you've changed. They kind of like the old version of you. We get into this space where our habits create this comfort zone where we end up staying a little far too long. And so when you start to seek out those people who make you feel celebrated and lifted up for the choices that you're making, that's what's going to set you up for success.
Wow, so community is really such an important aspect of this, and I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a great segue to our next segment where we'll be talking about your community organization, Sober Betties.
Can't wait.
So thank you. So, as I've mentioned, up next we are going to talk about Sober Betties, the amazing community that Sarah has helped build, and how it's redefining what it means to have fun in sobriety. So Sarah, thank you so much for being here today with us, and everyone please stay tuned. Welcome back to Healing Begins Here. If you're just joining us, I'm here with Sarah Shoulak, founder of Sober Betties, an incredible community that's proving you don't need alcohol to have a great time. In our last segment, Sarah shared their journey through addiction, trauma, and healing. Now we're diving into the powerful ways they're building a sober community and using creativity as a form of recovery. Sarah, thank you again for being here today.
Absolutely, happy to be here.
So I want to start with talking about Sober Betties. Tell us a little bit about how it all began and what inspired you to create this space.
Yes, absolutely. And for those who were watching before, I am personally about 7 years sober. So at about 5 years of that sobriety, I feel like a switch went off in my head and I started to have a fire in my belly that said, I want to do something with this. And that I've gotten this far in this journey, and I know others can too if that's their goal. So the origin of it is really kind of silly and simple. But I was scrolling on Facebook, and a friend of mine who I actually work with now in counterpart with Sober Betties, Shane Briscoe, she had posted a picture of a tower of cupcakes and said that they were filled with rum or something like that. And I remember commenting on it, and it was like October of 2022 or something like that, or 2023. And I said, well, I hope that they're well labeled so that Sober Betties like me don't accidentally partake, because that's always been one of my biggest fears. It's not that I'm going to relapse and I'm going to choose alcohol, but I'll be in a social setting and I'll grab the wrong glass, or I'll somehow accidentally indulge. And so that was just the simple kind of warning that I put out there. And then that name stuck with me, that little Sober Betties, because it sounded like such a cute aesthetic. And I thought about how we like to dress up and kind of pin up retro vibes. And I said, I think there's something to this. And I met with Shane. She was going into event planning and pivoting her career at that point. And I said, what if we threw parties and had experiences that were just as fun as alcohol-based experiences, and they were just these safe spaces for sober people, but they weren't necessarily exclusively sober events. They were just spaces where you knew you weren't going to pick up the wrong glass, or you weren't going to worry about somebody going around with Jell-O shots or something, and it created those safe spaces. So I'm proud to say it's had a positive response. It's been really great to see people say, I'm so glad this exists, or I'm so glad that I found this group. So we're on to something, I think.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. So you guys host events around the community that just aren't centered and focused on alcohol, more centered on like connection, a retro vibe, having fun together. What are some of those events? Like, what do they look like? What are some of the things that you're doing in those spaces?
That's a great question, and on our social media I actually have a description that kind of explains the tenets or the values that we have in that organization. And the last one that I say is that it's really an experiment, that we are trying something really different, because we're social beings. We love, like we were talking about, community is so essential to us as humans, that we want to do things with one another. But usually these experiences are centered or have some big element to drinking, even if it's as simple as brunch or a champagne toast at a baby shower. I mean, everything is kind of subtly infused with alcohol, or happy hours after work, or networking. And once you start looking at that with your lens of life, of I want to find spaces where I feel comfortable or I feel seen, it can be harder to feel really safe in those spaces, especially when you have traumatic experiences. Some people just choose to not have alcohol for health reasons, or preference, or they just never got into it, and then they don't have a huge trauma response. But if you kind of look at us as trauma-informed fun, then we are the kind of organization that you can come to and understand that we're going to be a kind of a lighter side of it, rather than organizations that might feel a little heavy, where we don't ask you to bring your shame past the threshold, right? So what the events look like, we've done a lot of different types. Usually they're kind of like dance parties. So there'll be a DJ, there's music, there's photo ops, there's elements of like we were talking about, dress up, so we're building confidence. And with my background being in cosplay and like going to MegaCon and dressing up as a real superhero, you build a lot of confidence in that way. And we're kind of tricking people into doing that, where you don't have to dress like She-Hulk or Wolverine to come out and hang out with us. And we're not the vintage police either. So we say vintage retro vibes, but we're also not trying to regulate that or say that you have to wear a certain thing. We just want you to be comfortable and confident.
Yeah.
And once you come out, then we just trick you into having a great time.
So you don't have to be necessarily strictly on your path to sobriety, or you can just be still figuring it out, or maybe you are somebody who still indulges in alcohol but still wants to find those spaces that aren't centered around that for having a good time or for connecting.
Exactly. And when we talk about who our demographic is, we've actually been really surprised by it. When we first started out, obviously with a pinup aesthetic and who we are, we marketed to a lot of women. We just thought pinup, retro, women, girl power, let's have that be what it is. And as we started doing more events, we actually had people ask if guys were welcome too, and if other people who identified in other ways were welcome too. And we didn't want to be exclusive. We just said, if you have a good vibe and you like what we do and you're going to be cool and respectful in this space, everybody's welcome. And so we started not just saying Sober Betties, but Sober Bobbies and Sober Buddies. So whoever you are, you're welcome. And with that, I think that we serve a different need at every phase that people are in. So for someone like me, or somebody who's even more sober, longer term sober than I am, it really reinforces what you're doing, and it shows you don't have to force yourself to feel comfortable in spaces with alcohol. You have a network that will band around you and feel comfortable where you're at on your journey. To people who are starting out, who are newly sober, it can create that rock of a foundation that you need to feel like you still have a social group. Because sometimes when you cut ties with alcohol, you end up feeling like you've cut ties with all of your friends and that you've cut off all of your social interactions at all. And then, like you were mentioning, the people who do still maybe drink and who are just taking a night off, I consider those the dry curious. And for those people, you're just kind of dipping your toe in, where it might not even be a path to sobriety. Maybe you're just doing dry July or dry January or sober October, and you're taking that moment to reflect or have conversations about moderation. And I think as long as we can respectfully talk about moderation as a society and say, not everybody is an alcoholic, not everybody does have an issue with substances, but if you can't even talk about it and you're so gripped to it that you need alcohol at every interaction, that's why we like to have the opposite, to show that there's balance.
Yeah, again, that self-reflection element of who we are, where we're seated currently, is really an important element to know maybe how much we can handle or what we want to go see out in our communities and such. So I love that it sounds like it's open for everybody, as long as you have a good vibe and you want to come and have a good time, that they can come and be a part of these events. And I also love the term dry curious is great. So for those who are, curious about connecting with Sober Betties, what is the best way for them to learn about your events and stay connected with you?
What I love about the connection to Sober Betties is that we're not, even though we're showing this on OTV and we're here in Central Florida, we're not locked into the Orlando area. Obviously, since that's where we reside, a lot of our events end up being down here in the in-person side of things, but we have a really rich, healthy Facebook group that people can join. So if people are on Meta, they can join our Facebook group. If you're not a fan of social media, we have a website you can go to, Sober Betties, spelled Betties, soberbetties.com. And on that website, you can find a link tree that'll have links to all of our upcoming events where you can track what we're doing. And I've really enjoyed watching that networking of other people happen because of the event, where suddenly I'll be scrolling Facebook and I'll see this person liking this thing, and I know that they met at a Sober Betties event, and then you watch them lift each other up or get involved in each other's things or hang out in those ways. And so
that's that ripple effect.
Exactly, and like the little butterfly that goes out and ripples everything else. So I think social media, we've got Instagram, we've got Facebook, we've got the website, and ideally getting everybody to our mailing list, because if you're not on social media or you want to take those social media breaks for balance as well, then at least we're in your email inbox.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for being here today and for your work with Sober Betties and for all that you do for everyone in the community to have a good, safe, sober time. Thank you. So for anyone out there looking for community, whether through sober socializing, creative expression, or just hearing stories like Sarah's, know that you're not alone. There are people out there who understand and who want to walk this path with you. Stick with us, because next we're talking with Heather Parker, an outreach specialist from Recovery Connections, a peer-led nonprofit dedicated to supporting people in recovery. We'll hear their story and dive into the incredible resources available for those looking for support on their journey to recovery. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healing Begins Here. In this final segment, we're shifting our focus to the power of peer support in recovery. We've talked about the deep connection between substance use and trauma and how finding community can be a crucial part of healing. Now, we're diving into what support can look like in action. I'm honored to welcome Heather Parker, a survivor, a leader in long-term recovery, and an outreach specialist at Recovery Connections of Central Florida. Heather, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like for you to tell us first a little bit about your experiences and your story and what brought you to this journey to recovery.
So, like a lot of survivors, it wasn't just a one-time incident. There was multiple incidents over the years. First time was when I was 4 by a babysitter. I wasn't able to really tell anybody at that point, but I did make sure that he never babysat for me again. Yeah. Got creative. Next time I was 14, and it was 2 male friends. And it was the first time I'd really experimented with drinking and smoking pot. And it was very confusing because these were supposed to be friends. Next time, years later, was an ex-boyfriend. I hadn't been with him in over a year and a half, and he came into my house when I was sleeping, and I woke up with him on top of me. He had 3 of his frat boy friends in the house, and it was the first time I felt like prey. I just remember being scared, not knowing what was going on, and that next day, I did reach out to the police. And this was back in 1987. They were not very kind to me. They said, "Do you know that you're going to ruin this boy's life?" And that was my cue to shut up. And I was just like, okay. And I also think, there's this misconception, and has been, of what sexual assault is.
Right.
And it's so many things, and the spectrum is so huge that it's not always this violent rape by a stranger. And so the spectrum becomes very confusing, I think, a lot of times for survivors. And so it's easy to kind of buy into and downplay the things that happen. Like,
Right.
It wasn't that bad, and I'm going to ruin this boy's life. Interestingly enough, though, 3 months later, I tried to take my life for the first time.
Right.
And I didn't connect that at that time. Substance abuse wasn't really a thing for me. I mean, I was a casual drinker. Drinking was not a whole lot. I grew up in Seattle, so smoking pot was kind of the norm. But it still wasn't something that I was finding that I was abusing necessarily. The next incident was, again, a friend of a friend, and we'd been drinking. We went to bed, clothed, woke up with him on top of me. And again, it was downplayed. Well, I know him. It wasn't a big deal. I had him stop. It wasn't anything. Let that go. In my 30s, that's when it really hit. I got into a bad car accident, almost lost my life in 2000. That led to doctors prescribing hardcore opiates. That's the heyday of OxyContin.
Right.
I didn't go into full-blown addiction at that moment. It was, okay, we needed this for now. I would be off of it for a good amount of time. There was a good 3 years that back and forth to doctors, and then I'd have long periods of time without having to use anything. And I believe it was the end of 2003, 3 of my husbands and my friends raped me, drugged me and raped me. And I remember reaching out to my 2 best friends, women friends. One told me to forget about it and act like nothing had happened. Another one went and told my husband before I even had a chance to even process what was going on.
Wow.
What I didn't know is that one of the perpetrators was a convicted rapist. So this was not his first time.
So it sounds like your cycle of trauma and abuse and the overlap of substance use, it sounds like something that a lot of people may have experienced something similar. We know that 8 out of 10 sexual assaults are occurred by somebody known to the victim, and we know 1/3 of the time that this is by a current or former partner. And we also know that we struggle in our response to survivors in believing them and validating their experiences if they don't look like the typical media portrayal of sexual assault or rape. So how did you go from those experiences and those instances with substances to finding your place at Recovery Connections?
So after that incident, I did try to take my life for a second time, and it obviously survived. That, I think, accelerated the downward spiral for me. Within 2 years, I had hit rock bottom and ended up in treatment for the first time in 2006. And so that started my journey in recovery. And I believe when you said validation, that is 100% for me what was so important, and finding other people that this had happened to and that I wasn't the only one, and that understanding that this was not my shame. So that was big for me. And I think the journey into recovery and finding Recovery Connections, this wasn't around in 2006. It really was just this last January that I found Recovery Connections, and I found it because they have meetings at their centers. And I just came for a Smart Recovery meeting because I wanted to know what that looked like. And I was like, they're doing something here. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that the place felt good and it felt safe.
Wow. So that felt like the right place for you when you showed up. And then you ended up holding a position there. You work as an outreach specialist. Can you tell me a little bit about what that looks like and maybe how that has solidified some of your work through your recovery journey?
So I started as a volunteer because I was like, whatever you're doing here, this is kind of magical and I want to be a part of it. And I didn't know about the peer support. I just knew they had meetings there. Within a month, I was offered a job to become a peer support specialist. And I was like, you mean doing the thing that I'm already doing and having a title and getting paid for it?
Yeah,
it was great.
No-brainer.
No-brainer. So started doing that, and a couple months later, we were getting ready to open our second center, and they said, we'd love for you to be the center team managers for both centers. And so I went and started doing that, and then we decided to open this whole new department of outreach specialists, and I was like, yes, that is exactly what I want to do. Yes.
That's incredible. And so how can people who are on their journey to recovery or curious about what this space looks like, how can they reach out to find Recovery Connections and access these services?
So we have a helpline. It's manned 24 hours a day by a peer support specialist. It's 407-RECOVER. And then we also have our website, which is myrecoveryconnections.org.
Awesome. Heather, thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your story, and for helping other victims know that, if their story doesn't look like the conventional stories portrayed in media, that they're not alone, that their experience is valid, and that there are resources out there like the VSC or Recovery Connections that can help them. So thank you.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, as we wrap up today's episode, we've explored deep connections between trauma and substance use and recovery. We've heard from Sarah about her journey and how she created Sober Betties to build a community where sobriety is embraced and celebrated. And then we spoke with Heather about the life-changing work of Recovery Connections and the importance of peer support in the healing process. If you or someone you know is struggling with the effects of trauma or substance use, please know that help is available with Recovery Connections and the Victim Service Center. Call the VSC helpline at 407-500-HEAL or 4325 to connect with someone who will listen, believe you, and walk with you on your journey. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Healing Begins Here. I'm Olivia Oropeza, the Prevention Community Manager with the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, and I want to remind you that no matter where you are in your journey, you are not alone.